we do appreciate those of you taking the time on this holiday to attend the webinar and to learn about Scope 3. As we were trying to put this together and get everyone's schedules, this was the day that happened to show up. So for those of you who will not be able to join, or your colleagues who are not able to join, we will have this presentation available offline once we finish the production edits. And so with that, I would like to get into just a few housekeeping reminders. One is going to be our antitrust, but before we get into that, I would ask that everyone who's attending, if you could turn your cameras and your microphones off. That way our presenter is the only one with the microphone on. And if you have questions, you can enter those through the chat throughout the presentation, and we will answer those at the end of the presentation. As we finish up today, we will have some open Q&A to where you can open your microphone up if you have some very specific questions that are a little more difficult to put into a chat. So with that, I will go ahead and get into our antitrust. It is the policy of the Pine Chemicals Association to adhere strictly to the requirements of all applicable antitrust and competition laws. PCA supports the commitment of its members to full compliance with all such laws, whether of state or federal jurisdiction, and believes that compliance with these laws will foster productive association work while promoting free enterprise. There must be no discussion related to prices or terms of purchase or sale of products that PCA members buy and sell, or of other matters which may inhibit the competitive workings of the free market, including actions which may divide markets or create boycotts. As we do open the discussion up, if at any time anyone feels that any of the discussion is creating a possibility of an antitrust situation, then please, or the appearance of one, please raise your hand or please stop the discussion immediately. I don't anticipate that we'll run into that, but we do want to make sure that we are abiding within our antitrust policies. So today we are very pleased to welcome Kara Vogt. She's a senior technical consultant at Sustainable Solutions Corporation. Kara is a graduate, chemical engineering graduate of the University of Delaware, and she has 14 years in product stewardship and sustainability strategy. That has included developing life cycle assessments, product carbon footprints, and facilitating audits for sustainable manufacturing. In addition, she has been an adjunct professor at Jefferson University, teaching architecture and design students how to think about sustainable materials. So we are very pleased to welcome you today, Kara, and I will let you share your screen to where you can present.
Excellent. Thank you, Amanda, and thank you everybody for joining me today to talk about Scope 3 emissions. I know it's a hot topic item. There's a lot of ambiguity and questions that can be really particular to your different organizations. So I am here to give a high-level overview of Scope 3 today and, address any of your questions that you might have. So just before I get started, a little bit about me. I know Amanda introduced myself, but a little bit about the company that I work for is I work for a consulting company called Sustainable Solutions. We have been in business for about 24 years now, where our primary focus is just on sustainable consulting and sustainable services. So we have teams that work with corporate sustainability and strategy, product design, optimization. We also have a team that works within facilities, and we're looking at existing facilities as well as new construction on better design. And then lastly, kind of our core tenant that kind of infiltrates like all that we do is training and education. We really just want to promote sustainable thinking and practices. And so really educating, all of our clients and, their suppliers, their customers regarding sustainable initiatives within the market. So today, I am going to be talking about Scope 3 emissions. So you may or may not know what Scope 3 is. And so I'm going to just level set for everybody what that is, defining what it is and why we care about it. We'll understand the key market drivers on why everybody is starting to calculate them. And then we'll talk about some basic Scope 3 practices, as well as if we have time, we'll get into some industry challenges that we're seeing in terms of acknowledgments of, some of the debates and tasks that you might be up against. And then I do want to make sure we have enough time for questions at the end. Please do not hesitate, though, to ask questions. If I see them pop up in the chat, I will do my best to address them there. But if not, if I miss it, we will make sure that at the end we can address those. All right. So with that, I want to talk about what are greenhouse gas emissions, because fundamentally, we can't talk Scope 3 without understanding what greenhouse gas emissions are overall. So first things first is we have to talk about global warming. So you probably know, you may not know all of the science, regarding like climate change and global warming, but just to like understand like the basics is global warming is basically a long-term increase of the Earth's average surface temperature due to the buildup of specific gases that cause a greenhouse effect. So these gases are things like carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide that have been slowly or quickly actually like accumulating in the atmosphere. So what happens is they're trapping heat from the sun, preventing it from escaping back into space, and therefore it's leading to some climate disruptions within our environment. And so we're seeing things more like extreme weather, rising sea levels, and ecosystem and biodiversity changes. So we're measuring the amount of these gases released into the atmosphere as a way to track this global warming impact. And we're using carbon dioxide as our baseline, since it's really the gas that is emitted the most compared to the other contributors. And so these other contributors like methane, nitrous oxide, they're all then scaled to their impact in relativity to carbon dioxide. So when we're doing our carbon accounting, everything is just an equivalence of CO2 on it. There is a fundamental framework by the International Panel of Climate Change that gets together every few years to just make sure, the science behind it is accurate and if those like equivalencies are, if they need to change or not. So when we bring understanding that global warming potential and that climate change, risk or impact, we then get into a carbon accounting type of kind of program within organizations to really measure these total amount of greenhouse gases that an organization emits like for themselves. And so sometimes they are allocated per unit of production. Other times they're just, total accumulated, like total sheer amount of emissions that are emitted per this organization. And so when we're thinking about carbon accounting, there's some levels of control regarding emissions. And so we have these terms Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. And you can see kind of like a pie chart here of a company that, is measuring their various different categories. And so Scope 1 are the direct emissions that are occurring on site caused by your operations. So that is the CO2 emissions and all of those other greenhouse gases that are happening within your facilities. Scope 2 emissions are a little bit more indirect because so many carbon dioxide emissions are related to the energy consumption to produce a product. or to heat a building. Scope 2 is really related to the indirect energy that's used. Specifically, it's usually electricity. Now, sometimes you can be buying steam, which is also used as energy from a neighboring site or a district. And so steam can sometimes be in there as well. But those are like the two primary sources that have, you have a lot of control over within your organization. But then we're getting into scope 3 emissions, which is what we're talking about today. And scope 3 emissions are everything else within the purview of your organization for that has potential for emitting greenhouse gases. So scope 3 emissions is basically your supply chain and your value chain your customers use too, because in order to stay in business, you need to account for the fact that like your supply chain is providing you resources to do what you're doing as part of your organization. And so scope 3 is now accounting for those even more indirect emissions to make sure that, that we can't just negate the other aspects that the business has or that the business needs. And so I'll cover kind of all those categories in a little bit, in terms of specificity. So there are quite a number of standards that are recognized globally on how to calculate all of these carbon emissions. So there's ISO standards. There's a core set called ISO 1464, which talks about organizational scope emissions, project-specific emissions, and then how to verify these emissions. We also have an ISO standard that's talking specifically about allocating those emissions to individual product units too. And we'll talk about why that's important for scope 3 for your customers as well. And then the other core standard that's internationally leveraged is the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. The Greenhouse Gas Protocol has a specific scope 3 guidance, which provides exactly like what could be in and out of scope within the whole domain of the different categories and buckets within scope 3. And so scope 3, because it's basically everything else that's not directly related to energy use and or direct CO2 emissions getting emitted on your facilities, it can kind of be an ambiguous and a pretty overarching category. And so there's about 15 categories, give or take, of scope 3 emissions. And they're actually like kind of numbered like categories 1, 2, 3, 4 going down. And so the first big category, and very often one of the more abundant ones and more contributing ones to an organization's footprint, is purchased goods and services. And so this includes all of your supply chain. It includes the extraction of materials, the production of products, and the transportation of any goods that you are purchasing, as well as any services that you are using for your organization. So this could be your raw materials, but it could also be support materials. It could be packaging materials. It could be the software that you're using. If you're, a software provider and you have, you're using AWS as a data center for your servers. So it includes all of those that are of your supply chain. Then we have capital goods, right? So you're managing buildings, you're managing operations, heavy machinery, big equipment. So accounting for those fixed goods that you may or may not have to replace or, expand or grow is its own separate bucket. We also have categories for fuel and energy related activities. So while we are accounting for the energy that you're consuming on site and the CO2 emissions that occur when you're combusting, say, natural gas to power a boiler, we are not accounting for the fact that you have a supply chain on extracting that natural gas and refining it to get to where it is before you can use it. So this is accounting for the supply chain efforts of processing your energy and fuels. We then have categories to bucket your upstream transportation as well as your downstream distribution. So including, all of those distributing cycles and distribution centers and understanding the logistics behind that, which can also be pretty costly when you're trying to get goods and services out to your customers. So those are also separate buckets. Um, and then there's also, other categories that are involved as well. So, potential of emissions coming from waste that's generated, your business travel, your employees commuting or working remotely, not from your offices. And then depending on your organization, you might have leased assets or different partnerships, which might contribute towards your bottom line that needs to be accounted for. So there's a whole lot of different categories within scope 3 that may or may not be relevant for you and your organization. And so part of the challenge, or the difference within scope 3, is really looking at what is actually important and material to your organization, because some of these may not be that relevant, and you'd be able to kind of like ignore or kind of like nullify them during your reporting. So one example of kind of a scope 3 emission analysis, this is basically what we call a hotspot analysis, is where we're looking at the total emissions from all of those different categories. And we're basically trying to calculate or give a high level estimate regarding, what each of those are contributing towards your organization's overall footprint. And so this is just a general chemical company. And you can see we don't have 15 different categories here. We have, just maybe, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 6 of them, give or take, for it. So we've already been able to refine it because they don't have leased assets. And, there's other things that were just, very minor in relativity. So we were able to exclude them from our analysis. But you can see here, this big blue piece of pie is the purchased goods and services. Very often, chemical companies will have a decent share of their pie being the goods and services that they're using. So even if you are, all the way up at the supply chain, right, and you are managing the forests and like the timber within it, you might still be purchasing other goods and services to support your business. And so those can still add up and be a decent chunk of that slice. And then depending on how your products are used, it could be, the processing of those products or using those products might also start to have a footprint as well. So this might sound a little confusing or very ambitious of a goal. So you might be wondering, well, why on earth how do we get here? How do we get to like all this ambiguous, these very large concepts? Like, why are we measuring this? And so I like to kind of walk through the timeline and understand kind of the advancement of this carbon accounting, just so we can kind of understand how it's advanced to understand why we're doing this. And so back in the early 2000s, that's really when those standards, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and the and CDP, the Climate Disclosure Project, how they really began, because we started understanding more about, global warming and climate change, and they wanted to start tracking those greenhouse gases. So some companies really started tracking their direct emissions. That's that scope 1, and maybe a little bit on their scope 2 with like steam and energy. By the late 2000s, like 2010, we then were getting into a little bit of regulatory regarding just carbon, like CO2 emissions. So the EPA has their greenhouse gas ruling, the CDP really started to grow. Walmart had, for example, started to adopt CDP, causing their suppliers to start to measure their scope 1 and 2 emissions. Then a little bit after that, people were realizing, well, it's not telling the full story, especially for like the supply chain aspect. If we're just getting your own direct emissions, depending on what you're doing, a lot of it might actually be embedded within your supply chain. So then we started having scope 3 focused in and really started including that. So around, 2013 to 2015, scope 3 started to be rolled out as a concept to track. And then we get into 2020, where we have some legislation happening and regulatory efforts happening, where we're now starting to require scope 1 and 2 emissions, and maybe even consider some areas of scope 3. getting, 20 years later, we are now having mandatory disclosures of scope 1 and 2 in a lot of regions of the world. And then even scope 3 is becoming common for large organizations, depending on, what entity and where they are within the global economy. So why are we looking at scope 3 emissions to begin with? It seems, like a lot of work for like, what is the value of it? And so by including scope 3, we're really seeing the bigger picture of how our organization can influence the environment and society. So scope 3 very often is the biggest part of our footprint. Most companies, their scope 3 emissions, when you're comparing it to 1 and 2, that's like 70 to 90% of your total emissions, right? It's you have somewhat of control depending on your position and kind of, what categories you are, and they're indirect, but they are still very critical for your organization's success. You also can't really claim sustainable leadership without including your value chain and supply chain. I have a client right now that, they have a very strong grasp of their direct emissions, their scope 1 and 2 emissions. However, they just recently acquired another division, which is vertically integrated. And so now their scope 1 and 2 emissions are a little bit wonky because they have a whole tiered system in place of basically which used to be their suppliers, but are now within their direct control. And their scope 1 and 2 emissions look so much larger than before they acquired this business unit. But if they had really been focusing on including that supply chain, that category 1 of scope 3, they could see that actually their vertical integration of this new business unit actually is showing a lot more carbon efficiencies, just due to, how they're structured, how they're performing, the reduced number of transportation. And so it's actually showing a benefit by including scope 3 in their scope now compared to where they were before. So it's really understanding that full value chain and being able to like leverage, some of those efficiencies that they weren't really accounting for before. You can also leverage scope 3 emissions for innovation opportunities. Taking what you're learning from the bigger picture of what your organization has influence over can really be a great way to strike up some, really creative solutions. One of my favorite examples is Tide, the laundry detergent, where they were looking through a little bit of a different technique, but it still includes those indirect emissions. They were doing a product carbon footprint where they realized their biggest pot of emissions was actually their customers using the detergent because they required hot water in order for the detergent to be like really successful at cleaning their clothing. And so because of that hot water, it was really actually the biggest impact regarding their product. And so they then went back and found some enzymes that worked in cold water, and they now have this whole big line on Tide cold water. And were able to indirectly reduce their footprint by educating their customers on leveraging this product. So you can really have some good innovation opportunities when you look at this bigger picture. Another one that I really enjoy is looking at Levi's denim jeans, where they also had laundering as a large impact for their product. And so if you look at their tags, if you buy a Levi's jeans now, they'll actually say, like, try not to wash this after every use. Try to wear them, up to 10 times before laundering there too. Also a way to, reduce their footprint in a certain category of scope 3 with very little, effort, capital investment occurring for it. And then the last big benefit of scope 3 is risk mitigation. We're seeing all over the world a lot of big climate risk, a lot of big weather events happening, droughts, flooding, wildfires. All of this is related to, a change in the climate and weather patterns. And so by understanding your emissions throughout your whole organization really helps you identify like where some of those risks are to really work on, supporting your suppliers, supporting your customers on trying to mitigate those risks. Right. And so as we're doing uh, carbon accounting and just monitoring different, our different scopes is, we do have a sense of ongoing performance. So that you can never manage something if you can't measure it. And so part of the requirements of carbon accounting is really to help you monitor your performance when it comes to some of your sustainability initiatives and goals. So setting short-term and long-term goals for trying to reduce these emissions can be really beneficial because then you have ongoing performance tracking that you can then monitor regarding how successful you are at hitting those. You can also then do long-term strategy with your partners to be able to try to reduce your impact on the environment and find some creative solutions for the decarbonization strategies. So some of the market drivers behind this, it seems, it's a very big task to undergo is measuring those more difficult buckets and really chasing down some of that information. So a lot of the market drivers are really kind of spawning off of the Paris Agreement back in 2015. So the Paris Agreement, if you remember, it was back in December 2015, an agreement between almost 200 different parties in Paris, really trying to bring international treaty on the climate change. And so the goal was to limit global warming to below 2 degrees, preferably only 1.5 degrees change of warming compared to where we were, 200 years ago or so. And it's a pretty ambitious goal compared to how we are performing now. And so because of, this agreement having, a lot of different parties aligning on this universal change, we now have a lot of efforts where individual corporations and countries are trying to get there by setting different initiatives. So some of your customers and you yourself maybe have different regulatory requirements now that they need to disclose their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. We have the CSRD and the CSR triple D disclosures in the European Union, where they are now requiring companies that do business in the EU to, to a certain level, to disclose their emissions as well as some of their other environmental, social, and governance policies. Similarly, we have the state of California having Senate bills that are going into effect this year and next year, also requiring companies that do business in that state to disclose some of their carbon emissions. And this is growing. There's a lot of different regions around the world that are adopting these climate-related disclosures. So we have the EU, we have the United Kingdom, even Nigeria has some that is accepted. India has some pending legislation accepted. In the Americas, we have obviously California, but right behind that, we have a lot of other states that are adopting the same efforts as California, such as Colorado, New York, New Jersey, Illinois. They're all, soon to be approved state legislation that's happening. Canada, they currently have paused it, but they too had legislation out. Brazil also has legislation that's approved for requiring scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions reporting for it. A lot of these disclosures, it does the content on what you need to disclose is very consistent, but the level in terms of if it affects your business varies based on the different country. So many of these are publicly traded companies are required to disclose, and sometimes there is a threshold that does change based on which country we're talking about. Asia Pacific also has quite a lot going on. New Zealand was one of the first countries. China has some regulatory involved with scope 1, 2, and 3 reporting, as well as there's a lot of other pending legislation in the Asia Pacific region as well. So with that, because of this legislation, but also because of private initiatives as well, some of your customers might have requirements and understand your scope 3 emissions. And as well, because you might be the supplier, so you might also need to present data to your customers so that they can calculate their own Scope 3 emissions. So customers like Henkel, 3M, a lot of your customers will probably have some type of procurement guidelines regarding having some type of commitments to reporting your emissions. Your customers might have their own goals that are set to reduce their Scope 3 emissions. And because of that, you might be a part of their Scope 3, and therefore you might need to help reduce your own emissions, so it has a trickle-down effect there. So depending on, their requests, you might be getting a lot of different requirements and requests, understanding your emissions so that they can understand how you influence them. And another large initiative, and you might, if you are getting those customer requests, you might be noticing that some of those customers are a part of this initiative called the Science-Based Targets, or SBTI is the acronym that we like to use. So this is an initiative that came out of the International Panel on Climate Change, basically like talking about that, there could be some irreversible change that would happen if we exceed a certain level of degree change in the earth. And so they are really striving to prevent the release of greenhouse gases to not exceed a 1.5 degree increase compared to that pre-industrial time. And so there's quite a large number of organizations that are signing up through this initiative to disclose targets or commitments for aggressive reduction goals in order to support these Paris Agreement targets. So as of today, there's close to 11,000 companies that have signed up with SBTI to commit to setting targets and to achieving those targets. So there's right now close to 11,000 that are committed, 8,000 that actually have targets that are validated that they can achieve and they have a plan to achieve. And then, of those, about 10% of them or so, maybe a little bit more, actually have net zero targets, not just the reduction to hit that goal, but trying to get to zero carbon emissions in their supply chain. Very aggressive goals out there too, and they're receiving quite a large amount of growth. So just between 2022 and 23, they had an 87% rise in participation within this initiative. So some of you are probably aligned and signed up with the Science-Based Targets Initiative. Others, you might have customers that are requesting, or this could be the first time you're hearing about it. So some of these goals are very much strategic, and it's science-based. So it's not just to hit that target, but it's to have an achievable working plan on how to hit those targets. So as an example, this is actually a PCA member, public targets regarding science-based for the SBTI. And so this member has an absolute reduction goal of 27.5% for their scope 1 and 2. And so these are the more direct emissions that they can control based on a baseline year of 2019. But they also have set scope 3 reduction plans. So it happens to be it's a similar percentage for them. It's 27.5%, which if you'll notice, it's purchased goods and services. So that means their supply chain, as well as some of the other categories, need to support them in their journey by also working to reduce their footprint. And so, it's involving the whole partnership and in order for their organization to achieve success. SBTI does have a lot of good guidance and support on how to manage your scope 3. They have a lot of documentation on, how to calculate them, how to manage it, and how to even engage with your suppliers to collaborate on some of these initiatives here too. So it's not that they're just signing up just to say, hey, we have these goals, but there's actually a plan in place, and they do provide some really good resources in order to help achieve those goals. Right. Um, and so going back to scope 3, I did notice that we had quite a number of procurement people signed up for today's webinar. And I wanted to address the unique influence that you have on tracking and collecting scope 3 emissions. So when we go back to the scope 3 categories, because I don't expect anybody to have memorized it based on the 30 seconds I had it up before. We have, a lot of different avenues and buckets of emissions that could be potential for your organization. But when we think about procurement and procurement teams and how they're selecting different vendors, how they're, needing to approve contracts and everything, they actually have quite a lot of power. And so specifically in that purchased goods and services category, it's right, like they're working with the suppliers, they have the relationships with the suppliers, and they're the ones that have, supplier codes of conducts and all these other requirements that a vendor needs to sign off on in order to be approved by your organization to do business with you. And so that's a lot of influence that you can have in order to help impact some of these emissions, right? And so with purchase goods and services, we're looking at your raw materials, right? Some of your support materials in the sites, your packaging, your contractors, your consultants, your software, right? There's quite a large category of a variety of goods that we're including within this category. So procurement has a lot of influence on, the materials that are selected. But in addition, there's kind of a trickle down effect is if you choose a supplier as a primary supplier, it might, depending on region, they might have a smaller footprint for their transportation categories. Or it could have, a different, depending on what the material is, if you have options for materials, you might have a different impact based on the waste that's generated off of your site, say like a different catalyst or, support material that is used in that site too. So really optimizing your procurement policies and working with your purchasing team can be like a really strong way to begin even on that path of scope 3 reductions too. So there's some strategies out there like, prevent like over purchasing of products, right? You don't want to have like a large stockpile or a large oversupply of materials, considering different like design techniques, packaging techniques, regions that your suppliers are coming from, and even having some requirements regarding submitting your product carbon footprint information of the materials that you're buying. So there's a lot of power and influence that procurement can have. One of the most common ways right now is procurement policies. So there's quite a number of policies out there where the code of conduct and or other type of like procurement policies that are out there are starting to include requirements that the suppliers include or work with in providing their greenhouse gas emissions. So you can see here, we have two different policy examples, but they're all kind of the same, where suppliers are committing to respecting the environment and or measuring their global warming potential, which means scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. And sometimes it's even like addressing, setting goals and or providing that information to the customers that you're setting up the agreement with. And it's important to understand and just remember that, a lot of these scope 3 requests are coming in from regulatory, they're coming in from customers. And if you're publicly traded, your investors also are probably wondering what your risks are for climate. And so they might be asking you for it too. So while you might be selling your chemicals to a manufacturer, which is very customer facing or might have to reply to these regulatory bodies. Keep in mind that you might be that supplier, but even within you have a lot of other suppliers that you can influence. And so, even if you're not like directly being influenced by some of these final market drivers, there's still a lot of influence and, potential opportunity you have regarding, environmental impact. Right. I will say, though, there is a major challenge right now with the purchase goods and services. Um, there, obviously, you might have tens of thousands of vendors and suppliers that you're dealing with on an annual basis, and so that's a lot of information to try to collect. So how the heck are we getting these like pie charts and getting these estimates, of the services when it's, we just have so many different areas to tackle. And so there are ways to calculate it from a high level to get kind of an overview and estimate of what those emissions are. Because these emissions, you could have software providers, you could have raw materials, you could have chemicals, timber, forestry management, a lot of different categories. There are databases out there that are basically by sector. They give an amount of CO2 per dollar spent based on your sector, right? So the chemical sector might have a ratio compared to, timber sector, which could be, probably low compared to minerals or electronics. And so there are ways to do it based on like the financial or cost-based approach to estimate this purchase goods and services. There are benefits and there's not. You can also reach directly out to your suppliers, particularly the ones that are invested with, you say, science-based targets, or might be investing in a lot of, capital projects to reduce their own footprint. You could ask them for specific data related to the products you are purchasing. So that's called a life cycle assessment or a product carbon footprint. You might even be getting requests from customers regarding an LCA or a PCF too. And what those are is basically taking account, the total carbon emissions, but benchmarking it or allocating those emissions specifically to your different products in your portfolio. Very often, most companies don't have this data readily available. If they do, it's only on a very small portion of their products. But if you do, it is a way to like really refine that data and support your customers, and or if you're requesting it from your suppliers, to support you in refining your purchase goods category. So there are pros and cons. There's big debates on whether or not you should go with, the high level, quick, easy way of cost-based approach versus the actuals where you're getting that specific data from your customers. If you're not purchasing a lot, right, like they're not in your top 20, top tiers of suppliers, right, your top 20% or so, cost-based might be the way to go. But if they are one of your primary suppliers, looking at those actual space, getting those PCFs, the life cycle data, could be really influential, because the more accurate your numbers are, the easier it is to showcase decreases in your footprint later, right? So if you have a really refined number now, then through sustainability investment, through different initiatives, you'll actually be able to showcase the decreases. Cost-based, it's a lot harder to do. Right. So with that, I know I spoke a lot about carbon emissions and, supply chain. You may or may not have started this journey of Scope 3 emissions and trying to understand, what that footprint looks like. And so really understanding where you're at today can help you understand what to do tomorrow to start endeavoring down that Scope 3 carbon accounting, journey for it. So there are guides out there to help you understand your maturity level, right? If you're a beginner versus an advanced, you might already know where your company lies, right? In terms of advanced or, stuck in the middle or so. But I do recommend you take a look at kind of some of these categories and just even ask internally, like for your team, like, have we started this? Do we have anything within our code of conducts regarding supply chain procurement? Have we started to calculate Scope 3 emissions? And so for next steps, I would really encourage, those that are just starting out with scope 3 is try to do a hotspot analysis on those categories, right? Determine which of those 15 categories are actually important to you and your organization, and really start to figure out like a way to start monitoring or setting up, a way to track those emissions year over year, because chances are you're going to have to report them to a customer or to a regulatory body in the future within the next couple of years anyway. If you are already starting that, you're saying the intermediate steps, right? I would recommend really working on refining that data and setting up ways to have targets on reducing those impacts, right? So if it is purchased goods, if it's, distribution, if there's something else that's really driving it, really starting to think about, what are our targets and what are the goals that we want to set short-term and long-term to contribute towards some of these actions towards the Paris Agreement initiatives and goals. And then finally, if you are advanced, obviously you're already advanced, so you probably have a pathway forward, but continuing to work with your value chain on, implementing different partnerships and different projects to reduce those impacts, is very critical to maintaining that success and your commitments. So with that, I want to open it up to any questions that we may have in the chat. If any.
So I didn't get one in the chat, but I had received one ahead of time. And one was, how is biomass accounted for in scope 3?
Yeah, it's a very good question and very obviously relevant for the industry. So biomass is it's kind of outside of the carbon emissions that are often tracked, right? Because it's bio-based materials are already within the existing natural carbon cycle. So when we are talking about biomass, that is a way to decarbonize, is by going to bio-based fuels and materials, which is a benefit for this industry. So when we are reporting our carbon emissions, any emissions that are coming from natural sources, such as like bio-based, such as pine, for example, are to be reported separately. Because while it is still technically CO2 emissions, they are not necessarily the emissions that are contributing to climate change. So the general framework is to report them as a separate line item compared to outside of your total emissions too. And that is like one of the most critical strategies for it is you'll see a lot of, in the future, people investing in biogas and other types of like carbon capture from renewable resources in order to change their footprint, right? To go from, fossil-based to natural-based.
Before I get into any other questions, does anyone in our audience, if you want to raise your hand, if you want to ask a very specific question, we'll be happy to take those from you right now. While we're waiting for those, I did have just a couple that were preemptive questions that we kind of had ahead of time. So the next one was, we rent our main office space. Does that get reported as scope 3, scope 1, or scope 2? Where does that get reported at, Kara?
That's an excellent question. So I'm going to go back to the category list just to show it. Let me see if I can pull it up here. Here we go. So very often, if you are in like a renter's agreement for a property space, you still have control over the energy that you're consuming. So your offices that are right, like that you have control over your thermostats, you installed your own, manufacturing equipment, right? That's still considered scope 1. Now, there are cases where you absolutely have zero control over, the heating equipment or any of the systems here. You just have a little bit corner or a few rooms within a larger building where you may be able to say it is scope 3, but it is a very rare case. So if you are renting space, then that would be considered still scope 1 typically. If it's flipped and you're the one leasing out the space, that is generally your scope 3 because your renters are the ones that are in control of it.
Thank you for that. Okay, so we do have one question coming in the chat, and that is from Olivier. What are your thoughts or recommendations on how to collaborate as a PCA organization to work together in addressing common challenges and reducing scope 3 emissions in the supply chain?
So I can tell you what I see from other groups, and then Amanda, obviously you have more insight into PCA specifically. Is a lot of associations are taking up scope 3 as a way to set standards or to set up like a framework for reporting. Another way that associations have been, supporting their members is a lot of education platforms. So purchase goods is such a big, heavy impact within your scope 3 and carbon accounting to begin with, that sometimes just setting up a framework that your suppliers can then funnel into and then hit, all of the customers within the market or sector can be a really efficient way for everyone's time to be able to do it rather than every individual company moving forward too. And so that could be setting up, training academies, different, webinar series. It could be setting up a portal for entering data in that could get assembled in a, with a way to, delicately manage proprietary data there too. There's definitely ways that associations can help support the members. But Amanda, I'll let you respond if there's anything specific for PCA.
Yeah, so, I think from the PCA standpoint, we have conducted a life cycle analysis in the past dealing specific with CTO. And so I think for us continuing to look at these raw materials to see if we need to do additional assessments or footprints in the future may be beneficial for the entire industry. So I think that's kind of where we're looking at as an organization to see where we can have the best impact for our members. Okay. Any other questions in the chat before I move to some other written questions? Now we've got just about 5 more minutes left, so we want to make sure we do get to those. One of those questions is a little more technical, and some of our attendees may already have this, but for those of you who may be interested or who are getting into this particular sector, it's, do I get credit for co-generating power and selling it to our utility providers?
Yeah, this is one where it can be complicated depending on what your end output needs to be. So generally speaking, for just organizational level carbon accounting, you're kind of already accounting for it by measuring it. So your cogeneration, right, if you have natural gas or biomass, it's going to show up within your scope 1 emissions because you have those direct emissions occurring at your site. However, understanding that you're probably selling some power, to the utility and maybe buying some utility off based on peak demands or so, that can vary your impact. And so where that actually plays into account is your product carbon footprints and understanding how much you're allocating of that to your products for when your customers are asking you for that carbon footprint information. Generally, like, because you're using like a lower impact fuel, it's very often I've seen that it is, for the industry, it is either biomass based or natural gas based. for it, sometimes it's coal or a heavier fuel, is inherently your emissions will be lower than like your grid, the surrounding grid around you too, based on your utility. So just by calculating it, you may actually show an advantage within your impact too. But the challenge is more in the product carbon footprint side.
Okay. Anyone have a question they would like to raise their hand for before we finish up with maybe one or two last questions? Okay. So the next one is, I am not a producer, but a service or consulting company. Do I have to calculate scope 3?
So we get this one a lot when we do our trainings for suppliers, for our clients that are big manufacturers. So you may not be required to calculate your scope 3 emissions and report them to a regulatory body, depending on the size of your company. And that goes across the board. Is a lot, the CSRD, California, they all have thresholds regarding size of business. If you CSRD, I know they're still working on, there's a little bit of debate on, modifying that bill right now in terms of who qualifies. But there is a chance where if you're doing, if you're doing enough revenue in Europe at, 10 million euros, you might actually have to start calculating your own scope 3. However, your customers could still be asking you for your emissions data because software and service providers are technically still included within purchased goods. So depending on where you fall in their thresholds of criticality, is you might still need to have a sense of your emissions. Sustainable Solutions is the same way. We are consultants, we are service providers. We too are calculating our footprint. Should we be, prepared to be asked for that footprint just in case too. So there's still a scope 3 impact and you might have to be prepared.
Okay. So that kind of answers on who needs to report. It sounds like it's becoming everyone a universal, it's going to be a universal reporting tool. And so with that, are there any deadlines or any specifics for each geographic area that our members need to be concerned with?
Yeah, absolutely. So, for example, the state of California, this is one of the first reporting years for large companies. So companies that do business in the state of California that have over $500 million worth of business in that state, they need to start reporting this year. But on scope 1 and 2, and then there's generally a framework and a rollout plan for like scope 3 and assurance verification of those numbers, in the years to come. Brazil, I think it's similar. I think publicly traded companies mandatory reporting is in 2026. Is beginning. There's some voluntary kind of efforts happening right now. And then CSRD, this is the large companies that were under previous legislation have to report this year, kind of ongoing. But there is a little bit of a pause knowing, in terms of scope of companies in the future, is they're still working out if they want to adapt some of their qualifications for future and smaller businesses. There too. But generally, by 2028, there was a goal to have most companies over 10 million euro in revenue needing to report if you're a European Union-based company. If you're an American company selling in, there's a different threshold, and I think it's 50 million euro. And I believe that was 2028, but I'd have to look back at it too. So it's definitely within the next 3 years for most regions of the world.
All right. So what we're learning is that this is definitely not going away. It seems to be growing in its scope as it continues to transpire and as people continue to gather this information and report. So, Kara, I'd like to say a big thank you from the PCA for you taking the time today on a holiday to come and share your expertise with our members. I know that from the organization standpoint, from our association standpoint, this is only the first of probably many in a series that we're going to need to discuss in reference to Scope 3. So we appreciate you being a resource for our members so that they can get some additional answers should they have some outside of our webinar. So I'd like to thank everyone for joining today, and thank you so much to Sustainable Solutions Corporation for allowing you to join us today, Kara. So
Yeah,
big, big thank you for you. And we look forward to getting some updates from you in the future. And as I had stated, we will be releasing the presentation subsequent to today once we have a little bit of the production work and editing finalized.